I read this comment in the newspaper the other day from the Stutterheim Hospital. They said those patients who needed oxygen were given oxygen in the hospital, and less severe patients were given an injection, then sent home, because we noticed that being in the home environment where there is family support reduced anxiety. So for better or for worse, whether we have one or not, family has been a defining feature of this pandemic. My walk with Jesus was significantly shaped by this charismatic evangelical youth group I belonged to for about 2 years during my teenage years. And in that youth group, I was taught two key things. Firstly, the most important decision I would ever make in my life would be the decision to follow Jesus. I was reminded that decision had eternal consequences. The second thing I was taught, that once I had decided to follow Jesus, the next most important thing in my life was to get as many other people to follow Jesus as well. And the goal was nothing less than seeing the whole world decide to follow Jesus. We were told just how important this work was. In fact, it seemed, according to the teaching, the second coming of Jesus was apparently being delayed because not enough people had yet come to faith. And somehow this was now our responsibility. We had to hasten the second coming of Jesus, which was quite a tall order for a group of teenagers. So our work was cut out for us. The harvest was ripe and the workers were few. I started preaching when I was 17 years old, and I went on to study theology when I was 18 years old. And then in my early studies, I discovered that the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, had famously told his first Methodist preachers pretty much what my youth group leaders had told me, that you have nothing to do but to save souls. At the time, I hadn't yet understood that Wesley had a much wider definition of what it meant to save souls, but that's beside the point. The message was plain. My life had to be about saving the world, and maybe even with a little help from Jesus. But quite quickly the cracks began to show. Even those Billy Graham crusades, the benchmark for saving the world, revealed that thousands upon thousands of people made a decision to accept Jesus as their Savior, but far, far fewer actually went on to follow Jesus, to becoming a disciple of Jesus, an apprentice of Jesus. And then, of course, there was that spate of TV evangelists who had affairs and solicited prostitutes, and there were the fake healers, not faith healers, fake healers who in one way or another conned people out of their hard-earned cash. And my sense of this grand vision of saving the world began to wane. I wondered if the actual call was not so much about saving the world, but that most of us were more likely called to simply love those nearest to us. Jesus had a name for people like that. They were called neighbors. Some of us would be called to world missions, but most of us were called much closer to home. And in the Bible, the idea of family is central. Even the language of God is family language. It's father and son. And the Bible begins with a family in a garden and is followed by story after story of different thoroughly dysfunctional families. There's Noah and Abraham and Joseph and Ruth and Hosea amongst a host of others. And then in the second last chapter of the Bible, as Jesus announces a new heaven and a new earth, God says, I will be their God. And then this interesting phrase, and they will be my children. It's family language. Most of those listening today will belong to some kind of family, but not everyone does. In our reading today, Paul speaks of the widow who is really in need and left all alone. And so we recognize that there are some amongst us who have no family. But to those who do belong to families, without fail, our families are imperfect. It's really only the number of skeletons and black sheep which varies between our different families. For some, families have been places of refuge and healing and significance. But for others, family has been a place of rejection and criticism and struggle and deep hurt. And in between those 2 points, there's this whole big fruit salad of experience of what it means to belong to family. And it is in the midst of our imperfect families that we most acutely learn to follow Jesus. That's the point I want to make today. It's in the midst of our imperfect families that we most acutely learn to follow Jesus. So Paul writes to Timothy, and in verse 3 says, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need, But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. It is that our faith is first worked out amongst our own family, amongst those who are nearest to us. Just a few examples. It's in family that we learn to serve. We often in churches have these foot washing ceremonies in Holy Week, but I think what it really means to serve one another is more nitty gritty. It's the actual down and dirty work of emptying the garbage and washing dishes and cooking meals and changing nappies. It's in the family that we learn, we discover in ourselves the spirit of generosity. I've officiated at enough weddings and funerals, I've been a grandfather long enough to witness firsthand the extravagant generosity that families shower on one another in moments of need or moments of celebration. It's really not uncommon to hear a parent say, I will do whatever it takes for my child. And so in families we learn the art of joyful sacrifice, not sacrifice because we feel guilty or out of duty, but just because we cannot help ourselves, of giving without really even carefully counting the cost. And it's in families where we learn to forgive, and if not to forgive, the importance of forgiveness. With too much at stake to just walk away from one another or to brood for too long, we fight to find the way of forgiveness. And when forgiveness cannot be found, it causes in families unimaginable pain and distress, which simply tells us the importance of the family to us and the importance of forgiveness. And it's in families that we learn the meaning of love. The love of being wholeheartedly focused on the well-being of the other. I remember as a young youth pastor, I had not yet learnt the lesson that parents are very protective of their children. So I once innocently went along and complained to a parent about their behavior of their child in the youth group. And I want to tell you, I got taken out so quickly and so badly that I timidly walked away with my tail between my legs. I remember it so well, which is why I recall it today. Because in family, we learn what it means to seek out the good of the other. And the other things, I can't list them all. It's in family we learn the meaning of joy and of sharing life together, of kindness and of patience. It's just lesson upon lesson of the kinds of things Jesus calls us to be and to do. Our families, with their everyday rituals and challenges, are the primary environment for us to learn to follow Jesus. But before I close, I need to make this observation. Our own families are not our only responsibility. As followers of Jesus, we also are introduced to others outside of our family or others who may not have family. On the cross, Jesus says to his mother about John, the disciple, he says, "Woman, here is your son." And then he says to the disciple, "And here is your mother." Because Jesus always broadens our family. God's claiming us as his children is not only about our relationship with God. Family language puts us in relationship with one another. And so we see it in our reading today when Paul writes to Timothy. He says, "Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him, encourage him as if he were your father. And treat younger men as brothers, and older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters, and all of this with absolute purity." Now, this family language isn't just a quaint notion. In fact, I find it quite subversive. It's disarmingly simple, disarmingly familiar, and yet profoundly challenging. Because if you are a child of God, and I am a child of God, then we are family. And I can't simply denounce you without denouncing our Father. And just as with our blood families, it turns out that it's sometimes difficult for us to live together in God's family. And it can be especially so because in God's family, we are wildly more different from one another than we are in our own. And the only thing we have in common is Jesus. But I want us to be sure of this today, that God has given us to each other. Listen to the simplicity of that sentence, but take it in. God has given us to each other. So in the introduction to his gospel, that same John who stood at the foot of the cross wrote these words. He said, "To all who did receive Jesus, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." So being a child of God is a privilege, long before it is a responsibility. And being a child of God is a blessing, long before it is a duty. But when we are a child of God, it certainly does come with duty and responsibility, not least of which is to be a family to those who have none.